Sure. So my name, obviously, Anne Marie Murphy. I am a registered nurse that located here in the United States. We are providing the work that I've done in healthcare. I've been a nurse for a very long time, and I'm actually an advanced practice nurse here. A lot of the work that I got into directly related to healthcare was community-based health, but I do have backgrounds in intensive care units, step-down units where people have acute problems but need to stay maybe a little bit longer, as well as in the emergency room. The very first thing, my goal here was to give you a little bit about my background. So I have been an advanced practice nurse, the advanced practice nurse since 2007, but have been in healthcare for most of my whole entire life. And one of the things that I noticed in life and in healthcare is that sometimes, even with the best of intentions, we sometimes make decisions that are based on faulty logic or information, and that has long-ranging consequences. In the United States, we have a huge problem with maternal and infant mortality, and a lot of my career was spent with moms and babies. And as such, I started to look into how did these things happen in seemingly a country with an advanced and highly accurate healthcare system. How did we get to a place where we were having these kinds of issues? But I think you kind of need to know a little bit about my background from the very beginning, back before I was a nurse, to get to this point. So this kind of represents the quadrants that I see in my everyday life. I am an advanced practice nurse. I am a mom of 3 children. I have trained a little over 17,000 individuals on implicit bias in healthcare. And I've worked in research settings where we look at how some of the different pieces of information that individuals are taught, what they've learned over time, and then how their biases play into the outlying information that happens. So in here, obviously, my nursing background comes into everything that I do. Being a mom and having to navigate the healthcare system with my children certainly helped to heighten that. But as I started digging into and doing work on how people make choices, part of that led me to looking at a lot of the research that looked at the inequities, many times talked about as disparities, but a disparity inherently is you can't do anything about it. For most of the problems that happen, they're just inequities. It's something that is causing something to happen. So we do have an opportunity to change that information. So one of the big things that I did was looked at why do people make the choices that they do? And because I became very interested in that, I got very into the research portion of this, in addition to the fact that I was still doing nursing, but very interested in how do we get to that next place? How do we understand why these things were happening? So I think the basics that you really need to do is to understand the fundamental idea behind bias. So I went out, Merriam-Webster, these are the standard things that come up in here. So whether it's an inclination of temperament or outlook, especially a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment or prejudice, an instance of such prejudice. And in research, we often talk about bias where a deviation from the expected value of a statistical estimate, you have to look at systemic error in sampling, testing, selecting. So currently on the same kind of what a lot of individuals there are already talking about. So the part that I realized in all the work that I've done with individuals in hospital systems talking about bias is that everyone feels that having an implicit bias makes you either a good or a bad person. Like if you don't have an implicit association that is deemed negative, that makes you a good person, or if you happen to have one that is deemed negative, that makes you a bad person. But having an implicit bias doesn't make you good or bad, it just makes you a human. So When I talk about bias, one of the very first things I think about and I talk about with individuals is that the very words that you acquire, your very first language is acquired from the people who provide care to you, whether that's parents, grandparents, when you go to school, all of those places, you have caregivers who really shape and mold the language that you use. And whether that's idiomatic expressions, if it's cultural things that are said in there, you learn those from people who are inherently biased. They've lived in the world, they've been exposed to information. And again, bias doesn't mean you're bad. It just means you've been taught to have a preference for one thing over another. That's all it really means. The biggest thing is that biases are a natural human function because, as it says up on here, you are inundated with 11 million bits of information every second. So if you can only process 16 to 40 of them, it's obviously going to be a problem with all the rest of those things that happen at that point. So because we can't process all of that, the biggest thing that we go to is our brain has to deal with those things. So most of the work that we do is unconscious. So I know that there's a book by Sam Harris called Free Will, and it talks about the illusion of free will, not from a religious standpoint, but from an idea that we are 100% in control of every thought and word and deed that happens. When in fact, really, the example that's in here, if a person notices a car stopping in a crosswalk, they probably notice the car, but aren't looking at the trees or the sunshine or the color of someone's shoes as they walk by on the sidewalk. They're content to understand the thing that's happening in front of them. And that prioritization is a fundamental evolutionary part of how our brains evolved over time. So when we were hunter-gatherers, if something rustled over to the side of us and we didn't learn to go the other direction when that rustling happened, or we might be dinner, the people who figured out how to go somewhere else are the ones who evolutionarily moved on. We had to learn over time, cause and effect. This thing happens, then I need to do this thing. And because of a lot of this and a lot of this happening unconscious, this is one of the things that people lose sight of. It's normal. It's a human condition. Everybody asks me what I mean by an ist. In this case, being an ist is assuming that you have bias makes you a racist, a sexist, or any other ist that we come up with, when really it's merely a preference, and that preference is based on patterning. So every person has it. It shapes your decisions. It can lead to great things that happen. Positive biases happen, and that can help you. But the negative biases are the things that hurt other people or limit your understanding of that. So context always matters. So we're going to talk about context. Again, like we talked about, when you are a child, your first language that you acquire is coming directly from biased individuals, and you learn the very words that come out of their mouth as being biased. So implicit biases, if you hear something once, again, we all know one isn't a pattern, but if you hear something over and over again, that repeated exposure to those messages is really what ends up developing those implicit biases over time. And they, again, as it says here, they can be direct. Somebody says something over and over and over again. As a child, when you're first learning, you don't know good or bad. You just know the person who cares for you says this thing, so it's a thing, so you use it because the context matters there. But for the most part, a lot of our stereotypes continue to develop throughout our lifetime, but some fundamental bases are put into childhood. So the stereotypes that we pick up, it can be television, it can be movies, it can be social media, it can be advertising, books, magazines, you name it. If you're taking in bits of information, those all have the capacity to shape and change the way that you do things. So our own experiences add to our biases. So we started off with learning language from biased individuals. We go out into the world and we're exposed to other things. We get biases from those. So to help us quickly manage, our brain just looks for shortcuts. So we're going to categorize things. You're going to get to a certain point where you're like, okay, shortcut, we're going to figure this out. So here's an example we're going to talk about a little bit today. So a dog can be categorized as an animal. That's a pretty simple one. It's not a vegetable, it's not a fruit, it's an animal. But we give things to people, things, whatever, and they get adjectives associated with them. So for a dog, it could be cuddly or it could be dangerous, but that could 100% be based on your experiences. If you have a tiny dog and it bites you when you're 3, you may not find small dogs cuddly. You may find them to be dangerous. It may be that you consider all dogs to be dangerous at that point, but those are based on experiences or even stories that you might hear from a family member. So if we look at these 3 pictures of these dogs, in general, if you survey people, they would say they're happy or fun, or as we're using our terms from the previous page, that they would be cuddly. And so looking at these dogs, you're telling a story about the dog. You have no idea if it's pleasant. You have no idea if it's bit 13 people, but you're basing this on the pattern. The dogs that look like this tend to be nice and therefore be more cuddly. If I show you pictures of these dogs, they may be the cuddliest dog you've ever met, but based on stories that people may preconceive, they may be considered to be dangerous. You've never met the dog, you're just looking at a picture and you're making an assumption, and that's why context matters. So if people make their minds up about where something fits, they're going to lump those things together. So if they have a bad experience with insert whatever dog you consider to be dangerous looking, or even if it's a cuddly one, you're going to put them into good and bad categories. And so the quick and dirty brain processing power that we use is putting those into those categories so we can react more quickly. Again, if I take 10 minutes to know that the rustling over here is a lion that's going to eat me, I'm probably not going to evolutionarily make it on, and my genetics aren't going to make it there. So we evolved to make quick decisions. The problem with quick decisions is we don't get to consider all the information, and that can allow for unfair biases to take root. So one of the hardest things when I provided services to healthcare systems to work with their individual healthcare providers, looking at bias is, I'm not biased. I don't want bad things to happen to people, or I don't think that. The main thing that happens a lot of the time is you may not know your biases. You may not have an idea that these biases are something that are creating patterns in your everyday life, in your everyday decision making. The problem is that everyone has biases. It's part of being a human exposed to anything in the world, whether it's my country is the best country, or I love the color purple and I pick out things that are purple. Preferences, detriments, it doesn't matter. They're all based on patterning. So if you don't think you're biased, you probably have to think again. One of the main things that I learned throughout working in the healthcare environment, looking at implicit bias, is you can't hit what you can't see. So if any of you are familiar with Project Implicit by Harvard University, Project Implicit is a series of testing that you can do that looks at your reaction times to matching one type of stimulus with the words good or bad. It could be foreign or domestic, whatever those two things are. So you have a series of things that you're matching, and your reaction times is that part where things happen because we can't sort everything fast enough. That reaction time, whichever one you are faster at connecting to the alternate word. So let's just say dogs and cats and good and bad. That's not necessarily something you're going to find on there, but it's a pretty benign answer. If you're faster at sorting cats with bad versus dogs with bad, then you would have a bias of having a faster association or an implicit association with cats being bad. And conversely, it can be dogs and cats with good. And as you go through this, you'll understand where your preferences are. So they can be something as simple as whether things are foreign or domestic, and whether that's good or bad. It can be mental health related. It can be race, gender, types of occupations that you have. But Project Implicit through Harvard University has a ton of material that you can go through and learn more about your biases. Most people will not necessarily recognize the bias. One of the hardest parts was that a lot of people who took those tests were like, I don't feel that way. Like, I don't make this association. And cognitively, given enough time and capacity to make these decisions, again, not trying to process 11 million bits of information in a second, but taking the time to process, you may not make that decision. But in healthcare, we make life and death decisions on a daily basis. And one of the hardest things is figuring out, how do we get to that next step? How do we understand that? And so cognitive dissonance is a real problem. Cognitively, you may not think that about people, but your biases are what you're making decisions from. So what do we do about this, right? So what do you do now that you understand that you have a bias? Well, one of the biggest things that I tell people is biases are normal and natural, but you can have some control over them. You can't make your biases go away, although you can lessen their effect on your decision making by reducing the number of times you're exposed to the same message. If I'll use an example that's a common example. If someone comes in that's disheveled, and you make a judgment call on their ability to pay for healthcare. United States, that's a big decision that gets made a lot of times in the emergency rooms. They have to provide the services in there. But then the next piece of that is, if we kind of forward this a little bit in there, you may make judgment calls. Somebody comes in a lot of times, they constantly are looking for things. Then you have different things that are happening, right? So when we look at this, we can use tools and tips to mitigate the effect of bias on the decisions that we make. I can't make your biases go away, but what I can do is give you some tools to have in your tool belt. The first and most important thing is to practice the pause. So what do I mean by practice the pause? Practicing the pause is giving your conscious, aware, rational decision-making part of your brain time to catch up with the quick decision that you made. Sam Harris, as I talked about before in his book Free Will, he talks about that there is he did brain scans and showed that there was a difference in time between when you actually made a decision and when you became cognitively aware of the fact that you made that decision. There's a gap. And so that's where the illusion of free will comes from in that conversation, is you're making decisions for yourself based on the time that it's going to use the information that you have at hand there and use shortcuts to get to that point. On the flip side of that, if you give yourself enough time to talk through this, if you practice the pause, it gives you a chance to make a rational, judgment-based call that has less bias associated with it. So, prime example, the 3-second pause is the minimum. It takes about 3 seconds to gather those pieces in there. That doesn't seem like a lot of time, but it's a lot faster if you consciously take those 3 seconds to understand some of the other things we're going to talk about. Which, one of the best ways to understand where bias sometimes has a place in your life is to journal your choices. So does this mean, why did I choose chips over broccoli? Sometimes maybe you need to look at those choices. But in these kinds of choices, it's like, why did I decide I was going to do this thing when I interacted with this person? One of the things when we talk about making decisions without really consciously being aware is driving your car. Many people who've been driving for a long time, you travel a distance, you get to your destination, but you might not remember that drive. A lot of people are, if you drive the same route to work every day, if you're doing the same things all the time, you're going to know that route. Brain consciously knows what a stop sign is, what all the different traffic rules you have to follow are, but you may not be top of mind aware of your driving to that. You may be thinking about something else. You may be distracted by something else, but really you still make it to your destination because that muscle memory, your brain remembering the things that it needs to do in there is what gets you to the destination. But making a hard look at your choices is a big part of how you can find those things. So when I worked with healthcare providers, it's, why did you make the decision that you did for the individuals that you saw today? This isn't about doing a detailed debrief of everything, but why did I delay something for someone? Is there anything that's in there that I need to think about? Why would I not do this, or why did I do this? Or are you having a bad day? There's a million reasons why we make the choices that we do. But one of the simplest things is just to understand, if you have already done testing and you understand what your biases are, and you interacted with someone who falls within those level of biases, having the opportunity to step back and look at your choices. This isn't something that needs to be a very long and involved one. Just taking some time to think back and look at some of the things that you've done. And then ask yourself the question, why am I making this decision? I have a sticky note that's on my monitor that when I'm working on things and I'm putting stuff in, why am I making this decision? And taking those few moments to consider if a bias is participating in this, if it's tired, frustrated, worn out, burnout, whatever that is, understanding why you're making a decision is just as important, because if you don't understand why you're making the decision, inherently, your chances are that your biases are at least playing some sort of role at that point. So I wanted to open this up so we can have some frank dialogue about the types of things that happen in healthcare, the types of questions that individuals have regarding the work that I've done. How does it apply? I have one, before we open that up, I have one quick story that I do need to share. When I was in nursing school, one of the things that was brought to our attention while we were in nursing school is the differences between different cultures, different races, different religions, you name it. And that diversity is something that I am sure the idea behind it was to open up and express that this is something to be keeping track of, some things to know and understand that may have this. But it was presented as everyone who is insert race, religion, culture has this view or has this thing that happens. And it's not just about genetic predispositions for a very specific thing. One of the things that we were taught in nursing school, which was not that long ago for you guys, but not that long ago in the history of things that are going on now. One of the things they said is that the reason why, in our case, African Americans have higher hypertension, diabetes, and higher cholesterol was because there was a genetic predisposition for it. But realistically, there is no genetic predisposition. Chronic stress is the reason why there's an increase there. So simplifying that this is something genetic, when really, in fact, it has to do with the decisions and bias that people have, and that causing chronic stress, which creates chronic inflammation, which I don't have to explain to you guys how that pathway works. But those are the kinds of things that show up. And even so I'm a certified dementia practitioner, so I always also work with individuals with Alzheimer's and dementia, which is a whole different story for the amount of bias that goes on for those that are aged. One of our big things that was in there is they were saying that these predispositions genetically for individuals who are African American created higher amounts of dementia, when really that same cascade that gives them hypertension and diabetes also are the things that are the mechanism of action there. So even in education, as much as we attempt to try to bring things out of that, there are sometimes things that are inherent in some decisions that are in there. And then really medical devices is a huge area where the bias in medicine comes in, because a pulse oximeter doesn't work as well on darker skin as it does on lighter skin because it was designed and tested for lighter skin. So there's a whole host of other things, but that's part of why I wanted to leave plenty of time to open this up for direct conversation. Oh, I can imagine. Probably so. Well, it does. So it does beg some of this, whether or not there's so a lot of bias have a kernel of truth in them, right? So I don't know if you're familiar with a work called The Body Keeps the Score, but chronic stress, generational stresses that happen because of bias are buried in the DNA that gets passed on and passed on. So the chances of that insult of chronic inflammation participating in changing the genetics of offspring is certainly possible, but my goodness, that is a far leap to go to that. Because realistically, let's be honest, we have localized problems that happen regardless of insert whatever marginalized group we're talking about. So it doesn't have to be one or another. Those things create different situations that the bias then presents itself in a different way. Because let's be honest, the way that, trying to think of something simple, the way that scarlet fever would present on someone that has a much darker skin tone is going to be different than someone who has a lighter skin tone. And being able to diagnose based on both of those is incredibly difficult because we don't teach people that. Absolutely. Well, but even like I said, like even a pulse oximeter is something that gets used throughout healthcare. It is a biased tool that does not provide reliable results. So let's just use something as simple as SARS COVID-19, right? If we have something that's a respiratory disorder and we're making decisions based on people's pulse ox, on what treatments and what next steps are, you're inherently not providing the same level of care. Even if you're not attempting to, you're using a tool that is designed using bias. And that's why journaling and looking at decisions that you make is a first step. That's how you look at the bias that you have. But having that bigger, wider scope of information to understand that we sometimes use tools that are biased. We sometimes use assessments that are biased. There's plenty of different places that bias shows up. It's not because anybody wakes up one day and says, you know what, I'm going to use bias against my patients today. I don't want the best for them. I'm sure there may be one in 11 billion that somebody maybe comes up with that idea. But I think most people who go into healthcare really just genuinely want to help people. They're not looking for how can I create bias against somebody and give them poor outcomes. So the idea is if we assume positive intention, then this is really one of those moments where we have the capacity to do something just a little bit more, that's what I'm looking for, something a little bit more comprehensive, where you can understand that maybe we're missing something here and we're not catching these things because we're using tools that don't give us that information. Mm-hmm. It's a great book. It's a great book, but it's not part of traditional medical school. And that's going to be a big part of it as we go forward, is being able to find a positive way to get those things included so that we're well prepared as we go out to take care of individuals. And maybe while folks are, go ahead, Julie.
Oh, hello. Hi. Thank you, Anne Marie, for the presentation, and Adan for organizing all this. So I am actually not in nursing or anything considered super medical. I'm actually going to be stepping forward into a role as a massage practitioner. But there is that potential that, we might be employed in a hospital or PT or those kind of clinical settings. And as I'm listening to this lecture, it's surprising me that some of the things that I'm hearing, such as the pulse oximeter, and that, really shows to me how much I don't know. So relating to that, as someone who's going to be stepping into profession as a new person, what are some things to be aware of, or what are some tools to use so that I can better be aware of such things? Because I also don't want to be overwhelmed, but I know there's a lot going on out there. And, there's also my own, my own processing around, just trying to figure things out in a new workplace and all that. So any advice on navigating that?
Sure. So, at one point, I was a new nurse at one point too, right? Mm-hmm. So even though you're not in nursing or that, you are still doing ultimately patient care. At the end of the day, the best advice I can ever give anybody is to listen to your patient. I had an anesthesiologist very early on in my career who was not listening to the patient, and the patient was giving them information that could have saved all of these additional things that ended up happening to the patient. And so the main thing that I always tell people is you have to listen first. So the first thing you can do when it comes to bias is to listen first. Understand that people come at, because it doesn't matter, we're all biased individuals, right? So we've even the playing field with the idea that we all have bias. So if you come into a situation knowing that you potentially have bias, and the more you know, like I did talk about Harvard University's Project Implicit, and I do suggest, if you haven't had a chance to look at that, to take the time and go ahead and take that moment to be able to go through and take some of those. A lot of them are geared towards the United States. They're definitely English language first. But it does give you an idea maybe of what things are lurking out there. Even if it doesn't genuinely apply to you, I think sometimes understand that all these different types of biases can exist. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. And there's probably 75 or more tests you can take. Not suggesting you sit down and take all 75. That's not the suggestion, but just to get a sampling of them that you're like, oh, I never really thought about that. And the more you understand that, the easier it's going to be to see bias when it happens. But the very first thing I tell people when you work on bias is you have to go back to that origin story. When did you first learn people were different? What did your family teach you about people who were different? Any of those sentinel event moment stories where you did that, and then examine your own vernacular. Look at the words and phrases that you learned from your childhood that have created and went their way over to your adult language, because you acquire language. I think that's the hardest part for people to understand. Your very first language is acquired. People are giving you words. You aren't learning them. You're being given them. And so that's the hardest part for people to do. But as far as understanding all of the overarching things, don't get bogged down in the details. There's enough information to keep you busy for the rest of your life and probably 3 more generations of life worth of information on the internet. One of the basics that I tell everybody is if you're doing something or it's a procedure, you need to understand how it was tested. I can answer that for you. It wasn't tested on individuals who were not Caucasian men. Because most of the stuff that is just by sheer numbers, volume, and proximity, they have genuinely normally been done on there. There is a movement and an organization that's here in the United States that is actually looking to move over to where you go, to the UK, that is called Now Included. And the idea is to get people who are not Caucasian men involved in clinical trials. And that means not just medications, but also how does this pulse oximeter work? How does this EKG machine work? How does insert all the other things that we use? How do these things actually work? And how does that work on different types of individuals? So they're working very hard at working with pharmaceutical companies to make sure that there is no difference that happens there. But then on the flip side of that, also looking at medical equipment, especially durable medical equipment, where you're using scanners or other things where skin color matters. And if it's not giving an accurate reading, then you're making bad decisions based on bad data.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. And that's part of it, right? This isn't something that inherently you talk about in school. There's not a learn about your biases 101 class. It would be a lot simpler, or even to understand how these things come up. And that's actually, so I'll back this up. How I got involved in doing this in healthcare systems is a healthcare system had a sentinel event. Something tragic or near tragic happened. And in order for them to continue functioning, they had to figure out what the root cause was. So nursing, very specifically, but healthcare in general, our job is to do a root cause analysis, right? Like the 5 whys. We get to the why of the why of the why of the why of the why did this happen? And what they inherently found was people were making decisions based on assumptions that are not based in fact. So our maternal mortality, I've been involved in our maternal mortality review committee for our state and several other states around here, informing them. And the idea behind it was we have African-American women dying at, depending on where you're at, 4 to 10 times more likely. And if we account for everything other than race, they still die at that rate. So it's not because they were in poor health. It's not because they didn't have access. It's not because they weren't insured. It's not. The rates, when you account for everything else, stay the same except for they're not Caucasian. That's a problem. because then that tells you bias is coming into this. So in these particular hospital systems where I did this, the root cause is people don't talk about bias. And if you don't talk about bias and you don't know what your biases are, you don't know that you're making decisions based on it. And that's one of the hardest things, right? If you don't know that you have a bias, then you're not going to have any idea that you need to change how you're doing things. It's unfortunate, but it is the way that it is. Does anybody else have any other questions? One thing I can do is I'm assuming that you'll have everybody's email addresses that are in here, and even those that weren't able to attend but had signed up. I do have a list of resources that are available, so I can send that directly to you, Eden, and then we can get that information out to everyone if they're looking